Well, for me, to reform means the future, how we might mould it with imagination into a better shape for all. Although I must admit, since I became your father, it's become more specific for you, my children, my 2 girls who will grow into women. And maybe that's why when I cast a reforming eye about our world, our lives, viewing it through your bodies, your minds, I kept seeing at the root of so many of the ills that threaten you, injustice, oppression, violence and pollution, people like me, men. I looked harder and listened too, put my ear to how we are, what we do, tried to discern the undercurrents of our nurture, the inherited habits and behaviours, which day by day it's so easy to forget are there. And when I did, I heard others who'd seen the same and who were already having this conversation of cause and concern about what we teach and learn when it comes to ideas of what it is to be a man. But I also saw this talk was, in the scheme of things, new, still forming a recent debate despite the age of the issue and its spread about our globe, which at first seemed odd. I mean, the discussion about what women might be, could be, has been running for generations. For decades, women have been embracing change in themselves and society as a path towards a fairer future. As a sex and a gender, they've looked forward, see, and in doing so unlocked the parts of themselves kept from them by society. But men, well, we've hardly been doing the same. But then, isn't that always the way? Attention is paid most by those paying the highest price. And for men living in our systems of patriarchal domination, well, this has rarely, if ever, been them. The white male and his equivalent in other cultures have made their worlds to fit them, so they might reap its rewards most easily. What are considered masculine traits are more highly prized, advantages of life more accessible, their assumed superiority unquestioned in plain sight. So hey, why talk about what might be wrong or unhealthy about masculinity? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But maybe that's why those conversations I heard when I put my ear to how we are about men and who we might be have finally begun. Because our traditional ideas of being a man are just that, broken, outdated, unhelpful and harmful, and not just to women and the poor, but to everyone, including, I'd say, the majority of men. Which is why I hope I'd be standing here now saying the same if I didn't have daughters but sons. Because regardless of sex, we need to talk, we really do for once, about what men might become. Take a lead from feminism and imagine what might they be and how might we as a species come someday to equate a more positive charge with masculinity. So, as you can see, what began as a pretty selfish view, how to make the world better for my children, you, and therefore for me, has grown somewhat to encompass the world. Just, it has to be said, as a certain variety of traditional, rogue, brittle, toxic, call it what you will, masculinity has. But if we're going to make progress, make no mistake, both are going to have to be addressed at once. The intimate and the universal, the personal and the global, how men are one-to-one with each other and women and children, but also how the idea of a man sits across our cultures, religions, nations, because neither can happen alone. The personal informs the political, the domestic, the public, and vice versa, a spiral of influence that tightens over time. So it's that spiral we need to slow, unwind. The way what we teach about gender becomes who we are until it feels like nature, the normal, when really, mostly it's not, it's nurture. Which is why this tightening spiral can be our solution too. What did Larkin say? Man hands on misery to man, it deepens like an ocean shelf. Well, yes, but an ocean shelf slopes the other way too. And we have to believe that instead of a deepening, a shallowing of inherited pain is also in our power. That what we pass on is what we become, for good as well as bad. Otherwise, how else is progress made? So that's my stall, my daughters. The dominant perceptions of masculinity across the globe and cultures is harming us all. Men, women, girls, boys, humans, animals, flora and fauna. But until recently, this hasn't been addressed. Why? Because those same patriarchal ideas inform the systems we live in. Until those perceptions aren't seen as choices at all, but just how things are, like the air or the tides or the shedding of leaves from a tree. But to let that be, in the face of the evidence I've seen, well, that doesn't seem fair or wise or good enough to me. Before I continue, let's get some things clear. What I am and am not talking about here. Firstly, I know there are many kinds of men, and most, I hope, want to be good. And there is a degree of nuance in our being. Gay, straight, somewhere in between, the geek, the muso, the sportsman, the stay-at-home dad. But in general, across the world, the rules of being a man still, well, rule. As a recent Samaritans report has put it, men still compare themselves when it comes to masculinity to a gold standard which prizes above all power, control, invincibility. So much of their being is taken up with trying to prove their value and worth, not through being who they are, but through what they do. We expect boys to be boisterous rather than bookish, fathers to be earners more than carers, and for boys and men to be less attuned emotionally than girls or women. Which brings me to sex and gender, which, and it's so important to hammer this home, aren't the same thing at all. Sex, you see, is about the chromosome, biological fact. You both have XX while boys have XY, and along with those pairs, you more estrogen, they testosterone. Because of this, our hardware, as many will jump to tell you, isn't wired exactly the same. And I see how that could be true, I really do. I have a punch bag hanging in our barn. Sometimes when frustrated, angry, I like to hit it again and again, and then I feel better. Your mother, however, doesn't need to do the same. If she's having those emotions, she'll go somewhere quiet, alone, or speak to her own mother on the phone. All that said, at the same time, I know many women out there who'd rather ease their frustration by hitting the bag, and many men who do the same by going somewhere quiet, alone, like your mum. And this is what the surveys, the studies now show, that in infant males and females, there's much more overlap than difference. And yes, those chromosomes govern us to a certain extent, but that extent is more limited than we like to think. And so no reason to justify unfair treatment or to cut down on choices for one group or another, just because slightly more men hit the bag and slightly more women want to talk to their mother. Because whatever our hardware, it's our software that runs us. And that isn't written by genes, but experience, by example, in the pressures, both overt and subtle, that tell us from early in the cradle what it is to be not male or female, but a man or a woman. Gender, you see, by definition, is a myth-made beast, created upon a sketch of biological difference, yes, but then fleshed out and given movement, action, with the stories, habits, and often prejudice that most benefits those holding the reins and the power. To put it simply, sex, a biological category, is what we are, and gender, a cultural category, is what we feel, think, or are told a man or woman should be. What are the attributes of masculine or feminine? What the expectations, behavior, duties, rights, and roles? Chromosomes don't change, but thoughts and feelings do, which means that ideas and perceptions of gender can too, and often have. Not long ago, for your great-great-great-grandmother, having a womb meant she couldn't vote, take part in politics, or expect to ever do the same jobs as a man. Now, both of you, exactly the same kind of biological female, aren't the same kind of woman, because you can. The playing field is still far from level, and God knows there's loads more to be done, but in terms of imagining themselves out of culture's constraining version of their gender, then there's no doubt it's men 0 and women 1. Although, of course, that's another problem. That versus trap into which I've just fallen. The way in which, from early on, boys and girls are routinely viewed in opposition. Troublesome versus compliant, active versus passive, loud versus quiet. Of course, masculinity's been fluid too, flexing over the ages and time. 200 years ago, the power suit was a wig, tights, and high heels. While for the Spartans, to be a real man meant sleeping with one was part of the deal. But since the agricultural revolution, well, there's been barely any change. Perhaps in parenting we've made the greatest strides, though nowhere near enough again. But the baseline of what it means to be a man, that's pretty much remained the same. Aggression, competitive, a provider who's protective, emotionally past the age of 3, distant or reticent at best, illiterate at worst, strong, brave and hard, a father but not a carer, a hunter in modern dress, bringing home the bacon, the higher wage, a human of rational certainty, powerful, an accumulator of wealth, tribal of instinct, but stoically independent if he needs to be. American social scientists in the 70s came up with 4 rules of Western masculinity. No sissy stuff, be a big wheel, a sturdy oak, and give 'em hell. Now, 5 decades on, for most of the globe, these markers haven't moved, which is pretty crap. I mean, I don't want the men you'll meet to be restricted by these rules. I want them to be informed by and have more options than that.